Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar video. In this one I want to give my thoughts on the first episode of the Avatar Braving the Elements podcast, the official Avatar companion podcast that they announced a bunch of weeks ago. The trailer we got last week, the first episode has launched today. So I've listened to it. As you can see, it is here on iHeartRadio. But it's also available on basically anywhere you can get podcasts. Like literally just go to your podcast app, search Avatar Braving the Element, you'll find it. You can subscribe, download the episode, and it's right here. It's called The Boy in the Iceberg, June 22nd, 2021, 66 minutes long. Longer than I expected. I was a little worried going in that they might have very short episodes and it would just be like really minor short recaps. But actually, no. In this episode, we got like a 50-minute discussion on The Boy in the Iceberg, which was quite good, way more than I expected. And, you know, as the description says here, in our first ever episode, get to know Janet and Dante, find out what to expect in our first season, and dive into The Boy in the Iceberg. So, yeah, the get to know part, I felt thankfully was only like a few minutes right at the start. They didn't make it like a big 30-40 minute discussion on their careers and stuff like that. They're aware people are here for the Avatar stuff. This is Korra and Zuko hosting this podcast. That's what you want to hear about. So just a quick intro into who they are and their careers, and then we jump into this. I think that was the best way to do it. You know, they didn't have an interview here for the first episode. It was probably the way to go ultimately, in that this at its core is what this podcast is. They will have interviews, and that's going to be cool, but mostly the idea is that it's going to be Janet Varney and Dante Basco rewatching Avatar and discussing the episode. So in short, it is a fan podcast discussing the episodes that happens to have two voice actors as the host. Yes, you get a little bit of insight because Dante, of course, worked on the episode they're discussing, and Janet Varney herself is a voice actor and has worked with Dante on Korra, so they have an insight from that perspective. But in terms of them actually discussing the episodes, they still have to just discuss it as fans. And that's probably the interesting part, and it really comes down to, do you value voice actor opinion on the episodes quite highly or not, or do you just view them as another fan? And that's really what I think, in terms of a recommendation, this first episode comes down to. Was there any insight here I haven't heard anywhere else from any fan? No. Have I heard more in-depth analysis? Yes. Have I heard worse analysis? Sure. So in that sense, it was just good. And they get on really well. Like their dynamic together, recording this obviously is quite good. But it's just a discussion of the episode at its core. And how much you value that is obviously entirely up to you. I felt, as like a hardcore fan, I didn't like learn anything new from this podcast. Did I expect to? Not necessarily, but in that sense, I do think the podcast ultimately is aimed at like more sort of casual fans, people who I get the impression it's really aimed at people who got into Avatar from Netflix, and it's just meant to be sort of your insight into some opinion if you're recently into the show because of the recent popularity, that sort of thing. Because, you know, most hardcore fans who've been in the fandom for a long time, you've probably heard this sort of analysis and these opinions before. And like I said, they don't go particularly in depth on any sort of behind the scenes talk necessarily. Again, Dante brings up a few points here or there. But again, you've probably heard this stuff from interviews with him before. So to me, the intrigue of this podcast is going to be more on what they have that basically the fans don't usually have access to, and that is they're going to be interviewing a lot of the cast and crew. That didn't happen on this podcast, but in future episodes we will be getting that. Like, we know there's going to be like Jenny Kwan and so on. The voice of Suki is going to be on an episode. My question is, when she is on, is that just a separate segment that is an interview with the voice actress of Suki, or is she the third host on the recap of the Warriors of Kyoshi or whatever, whenever they choose to have her on, because that's what I would actually really like to see. Okay, it's Janet and Dante discussing the episode, but it would be very cool if they had sort of the specific voice actor for like a unique character who maybe only appears in that episode also join them for that discussion to add in the Suki perspective on this episode. They're having the voice actor for Bumi on at some point, so 105 is the Bumi episode, so might they have him on to just give his thoughts on playing Bumi and, you know, the episode and so on. That's what I would really want, rather than necessarily just completely separate interviews necessarily with the voice cast. But what they did announce, probably the most interesting thing from this whole first episode, was right at the end they revealed, as part of the launch week for the podcast, big special event here. Yes, the episodes are going to be weekly every Tuesday. Tuesday is their day for new episodes. But for the first week, they'll have the second episode out this week on Friday. And that episode is going to be the big Mike and Brian interview. So on Friday, we're going to get that podcast, a big interview with Mike and Brian. That's going to be pretty exciting. That's the big one here. And I'm glad they're doing something like that. Now, my impression is that is just an interview. They probably won't be helping to recap episodes or anything like that. But that is a major thing. Mike and Brian talking. Like, who knows? I can't even remember the last time there was a proper interview with them. They've made comments about stuff recently, but there's been no like proper interview discussion with them. They've been very sort of silent, keeping to themselves the last few months. So this is actually going to be quite interesting, even though I'm assuming this was maybe recorded a few months ago. But we'll have to wait and see, of course, what they do and don't say. But Mike and Brian are always interesting to see, discussed. But beyond that, like, I don't really know what else I really should say. Like, is it well produced? Yes, they have some kind of like segments. They have some sound clips from the show. They play some quotes kind of here and there. I think it is at times a little bit weird in that they'll speak for like, say, 3-4 minutes, and then there'll just be like a random like break, and then they'll come back like after literally like 2 or 3 seconds, and they just continue on, and it's like what's going on there? Like, was that like an edit in the middle of the recording, or what? Were you recording it in segments? And again, for like a 66-minute podcast, and especially when like you assume they recorded probably the intro a little bit separately than the core of the episode, it was a bit weird to see like there's a lot of cuts here, and it's unclear of like, are you just breaking this up a little bit with some clips, or did you actually pause in the middle of the recording? And maybe that's just me as a podcaster, where like I'm perfectly fine with doing like a 2-hour podcast with not really a break or any need to edit anything. But that in terms of the flow, I just did find that a little weird, that like you're reviewing just one episode and a relatively simple plot episode, but they had so many different like sections as going through it. Like Four Nations forums, they had a few, sections, kind of like gimmick sections, where it's just like, oh, Animal Crossing to have a quick discussion on like the animals of like Appa, and this is where you got the idea of like, okay, how good of analysts of media are Dante Basco and Janet Varney, and you saw with Janet especially, she was referencing like the art book and stuff like that. She clearly made sure to do her research here in terms of, I guess, like rewatching the episode, writing notes for the episode, reading the book and stuff like that. Just because you can tell she doesn't want to come across like she doesn't know what she's talking about to hardcore fans. And you could tell that, I think, a little bit with both of them, that they've done some work to make sure that they're knowledgeable about what they're talking about, which I like to hear. I definitely did enjoy that, and it was a bit like, yo, this is actually decent discussion. Not the best discussion I've ever heard, but it's good and much better than anything you really hear from them in terms of like answering like questions at interviews or conventions, where they typically give the same answer over and over again. Here, they have to give their thoughts on every aspect of the episode, and that's interesting. But again, my thoughts here were just basically, I thought they had good opinions as fans, and not specifically because they were voice actors. And I think that's a key point in this, in that like I don't tend to just kind of like jump just because the voice actors, you know, are doing something. I still expect, you know, what they say to be actually interesting to make it worthwhile. And in that sense, you know, would I recommend this? Sort of. In that I don't think you need to listen to this podcast. I don't think you're missing out on anything if you don't listen to this first episode of the podcast. I think you're probably going to want to check out the feed, like subscribe, and just be there for when some of the more interesting episodes do come out, where it is like an interview with a cast member we haven't seen in a while, or the big Mike and Brian interview coming on Friday. That's the sort of stuff. This, if you know what The Boy in the Iceberg is about, this review is not really going to change your mind or give you an extra angle on it, or any of the stories that they told. They're not really going to like switch up how you feel necessarily. Like I said, I think, you know, if they are going to incorporate the other voice actors more into the episode, which I think they are, based on the fact that in the Jack DeSena clip from the trailer, they showed him talking about, I think, an animal. So I'm guessing that means he was involved while they were discussing, you know, an episode. That's going to make it much more interesting, I think. Having the kind of rotating guest, and the guest becomes more of a sort of guest host rather than just an interview subject. Assuming they do it that way. Again, I don't want to go into too long in terms of like reviewing the podcast, but just to make it clear that like it's good, but what this is basically a fan podcast that just happens to have some official kind of clout going on here with the interviews that they're going to be able to get. That if you want more analysis, you probably are better off going for more of a hardcore fan podcast. But if you do really like interviews and just sort of more kind of casual chat, if you are newer to the show, this probably is more for you. Hardcore fans, outside of just it's new and it's something that they're sort of hyping up, and that's sort of a reason to watch it by itself, I don't think there's necessarily a huge requirement so far to watch this one. At least this first episode with no interview subject. They're my general thoughts overall. So, fun, but not particularly like exciting or mind-blowing. Like I know a lot of people were getting excited in the build-up to this. I think actually listening to it, it's like, okay, it's not this thing of like I'm going to freak out because the new episode's live. Mike and Brian interview could be a little bit something like that. So on Friday, I guess I'll be talking about that when it comes out, because they haven't talked in such a long time, something could happen. Just hear them talk about where they are, when it was set, this interview. That's going to be interesting. So, yeah, they're my thoughts on Avatar Braving the Elements. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were. How did you enjoy this first episode if you watched it? How do you think they're going to do things with other interview subjects and how they can improve potentially? How did you feel about just them giving more of a sort of fan analysis of the episodes and the balance they tried to strike between, you know, discussing things from the perspective of voice actors who worked on the show versus just being fans? I felt they actually got it quite right here, in that I don't tend to like voice actor discussions when it's all about the voice acting, because every single interview, every single convention appearance with these voice actors is always those same topics. And I find it much more interesting, the voice actors talking about their perspectives as fans on the episodes. So there's that. I maybe wish they'd be a little bit more sort of opinion focused rather than just more strict recap. They gave opinions on some things in terms of the discussion, the analysis, but I definitely want to see them kind of open up a little bit more, which I assume will just naturally come because like this was the first episode of this. By the time they're like, you know, halfway through the season, I think they'll be firing on all cylinders and they'll be better. And that's just natural with podcasts. That sort of stuff happens. So yeah, give me your thoughts on the podcast here, but that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.